Before the United States was born, 13 colonies stood at the edge of rebellion, tired of taxes, stripped of representation, and shadowed by the iron rule of the British Empire. But this wasn't just a conflict over tea or trade. It was a war of ideas, of liberty over monarchy, of ordinary people daring to defy a king. From the frozen banks of the Delaware to the thick woods of the Carolinas, farmers, blacksmiths, and shopkeepers rose up against the mightiest military in the world. With muskets in hand and freedom in their hearts, they fought not just for survival, but for a future yet unwritten. This is the story of their revolution, of fire, sacrifice, and the birth of a nation. This is the American Revolutionary War, and it changed the course of history forever. It didn't start with gunfire, it started with resentment. In the years following the French and Indian War, the British Crown, burdened with debt, looked to its American colonies for revenue. New taxes rolled in like waves: the Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, the Townshend Act, each one stoking the fire of discontent. But the colonies had no voice in Parliament. No taxation without representation became more than a slogan. It became a rallying cry. Protest turned to resistance. Pamphlets filled the streets, mobs gathered in city squares, and tensions climbed to a breaking point. The seeds of revolution had been planted, and across the 13 colonies, they were beginning to take root. By 1770, the streets of Boston had become a powder keg. British soldiers patrolled the city, and every red coat was a reminder of colonial subjugation. Then came the spark, the Boston Massacre. A confrontation turned deadly as British troops opened fire on unarmed colonists, killing 5. News of the bloodshed spread like wildfire, fanned by fiery voices like Samuel Adams and Paul Revere. Tensions cooled briefly, but the resentment remained. Just 3 years later, the Tea Act reignited the fury. In a defiant act of rebellion, patriots disguised Mohawk warriors boarded ships in Boston Harbor and dumped 342 chests of British tea into the sea. The message was clear: the colonies would not bow quietly. In response, Parliament unleashed the Intolerable Acts, a series of harsh measures meant to crush the resistance. Instead, they united the colonies like never before. In 1774, delegates from 12 colonies gathered in Philadelphia for the First Continental Congress, not yet calling for independence, but preparing for the storm they all knew was coming. The storm broke on April 19th. A single shot rang out. No one knew who fired it, but it lit the fuse of revolution. The British pushed through to Concord, but by then, hundreds of Minutemen had mobilized. Gunfire echoed from bridges and trees as the colonists drove the British back to Boston, sniping them the entire way. This was no longer just protest, it was open war. Within weeks, militias surrounded Boston, laying siege to the city, and a new chapter began. From across the colonies, men gathered to fight, and from Philadelphia, a tall Virginian named George Washington was appointed to lead them. The American Revolution had truly begun. As the summer of 1775 unfolded, the war intensified. On June 17th, American forces dug in on the heights overlooking Boston, setting the stage for the bloody Battle of Bunker Hill. The British launched a full frontal assault, wave after wave, marching uphill under heavy colonial fire. Twice they were pushed back. Only when the Patriots ran out of ammunition did the Redcoats finally take the ground, but at a terrible cost. Over 1,000 British soldiers lay dead or wounded. Though technically a British victory, it proved one thing beyond doubt: the colonists would fight, and fight hard. Meanwhile, in the halls of the Second Continental Congress, voices grew louder, bolder. Still, many clung to hope for reconciliation with the Crown. But as months passed and more blood was spilled, that hope dimmed. Then, in early 1776, a fiery pamphlet shook the colony. Written by Thomas Paine, Common Sense argued plainly and powerfully that monarchy was tyranny, and independence was not only necessary, it was inevitable. The American mind was changing, and soon the world would hear its declaration. On July 4, 1776, the transformation was complete. In the sweltering heat of Philadelphia, the Continental Congress adopted the Declaration of Independence, a bold, defiant statement to the world that the 13 colonies were no longer British subjects, but a free and sovereign nation. Penned by Thomas Jefferson, its words thundered with purpose. All men are created equal, endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. With the stroke of a pen, the United States of America was born, but the ink was still wet when the realities of war struck hard. That same summer, British forces under General William Howe landed more than 30,000 troops in New York, the largest invasion in North America to that point. Washington's Continental Army, vastly outnumbered and undertrained, faced brutal defeats at Long Island, Kip's Bay, and White Plains. Morale plummeted. The cause of independence teetered on the edge of collapse. But Washington refused to give in. As winter fell, he planned one of the boldest moves in American military history, a surprise attack that would turn the tide. On the frigid night of December 25, 1776, as icy winds howled across the Delaware River, over 900 Hessians were captured, with minimal American losses. Just days later, Washington struck again at Princeton, outmaneuvering British forces and reigniting hope across the colony. These daring victories, though small in scale, were massive in spirit. They proved that the Continental Army, starving, freezing, and outgunned, could still win. The Revolution had survived its darkest hour. As 1777 began, the war was far from over, but a spark had returned. And soon, a turning point would come, not just on the battlefield, but in the hearts of nations beyond America's shore. In the summer of 1777, the British launched a grand strategy to divide the colonies, the hotbed of rebellion, from the rest of the colony. General John Burgoyne led a British force south from Canada, cutting through dense wilderness toward Albany. But the plan quickly unraveled. Harassed by American militias, slowed by terrain, and short on supplies, Burgoyne's army became vulnerable. Near Saratoga, New York, the British met stiff resistance from American forces under General Horatio Gates and the daring leadership of Benedict Arnold, who, before his betrayal, was a hero of the Revolution. In two brutal clashes, the battles of Saratoga, the Americans forced Burgoyne to surrender his entire army in October. It was the most decisive American victory yet, and its impact went far beyond the battlefield. The triumph at Saratoga convinced France that the American cause could win. In early 1778, the French formally entered the war as allies, bringing with them powerful fleets, seasoned troops, and vital supplies. The Revolution had now become a global war, and Britain would no longer fight only rebellious colonists, but an international coalition determined to see them free. With France now in the war, the conflict expanded far beyond American soil. British forces were forced to divert troops and ships to defend their holdings in the Caribbean, Europe, and India. But on the ground in America, the struggle continued. As the winter of 1777 to 78 set in, George Washington's army encamped at Valley Forge, Pennsylvania. It was a brutal season. Cold, hunger, disease, and despair gripped the camp. Nearly 2,000 soldiers died, not from battle, but from exposure and starvation. Yet in that suffering, something extraordinary happened. Under the strict training of Baron von Steuben, a Prussian military officer who barely spoke English, the ragged Continental Army began to transform. He drilled them tirelessly: discipline, formation, bayonet tactics. He turned farmers into soldiers. By spring, Washington's army emerged leaner, stronger, and more unified than ever before. The spirit of the Revolution had endured the cold. As British forces pulled out of Philadelphia and moved toward New York, Washington gave chase, clashing with them at the Battle of Monmouth. The battle ended in a draw, but it proved that the Continental Army could now stand toe-to-toe with British regulars. The war was entering a new phase, and soon it would shift southward, where the fighting would become even more personal, brutal, and decisive. By 1779, the focus of the war shifted to the southern colony, where the British hoped to rally loyalist support and crush the rebellion from the bottom up. Their strategy began with swift success. Savannah, Georgia, fell easily, and in 1780, Charleston, South Carolina, the South's most vital port, was captured in the largest American surrender of the war. The British believed the South would fold, but they underestimated the resolve of the backcountry. In the swamps, hills, and pine forests of the Carolinas and Georgia, guerrilla warfare took center stage. Patriot fighters like Francis Marion, the Swamp Fox, and Thomas Sumter, the Gamecock, led hit-and-run raids that wore down British forces and disrupted supply lines. One of the most pivotal moments came at the Battle of Kettle Creek in Georgia, where local militias shattered a force of loyalists, discouraging British recruitment in the region. The brutality of the Southern campaign was unmatched. Neighbor fought neighbor in a true civil war. But amid the chaos, American leadership found its rhythm. General Nathanael Greene, Washington's most trusted strategist, took command in the south. Rather than chase British forces, Greene employed a strategy of exhaustion, fighting, retreating, striking again, leading Cornwallis's army on a punishing chase through the Carolinas. Battles at Cowpens and Guilford Courthouse inflicted devastating losses on the British. Though technically British victories, they came at such a cost that Cornwallis was forced to abandon the South and head for Virginia, where the fate of the war would be decided. By mid-1781, General Charles Cornwallis moved his exhausted army north into Virginia, hoping to regroup and receive reinforcements from the British Navy. He chose the small coastal town of Yorktown as his base, fortifying it and waiting for support that would never come. Unbeknownst to him, George Washington, along with French General Rochambeau, was already planning a decisive strike. In a masterstroke of coordination, American and French forces marched over 400 miles from New York to Virginia in absolute secrecy, while a powerful French fleet under Admiral de Grasse sailed up from the Caribbean to block the Chesapeake Bay. By September, Cornwallis was trapped, his army surrounded on land by 17,000 American and French troops, and his escape by sea cut off. The siege of Yorktown began. For nearly 3 weeks, cannon fire rained down on the British line, reducing their defenses to rubble. On October 14, American and French soldiers stormed the final British redoubts in a dramatic nighttime assault. With no hope of relief, Cornwallis surrendered his army on October. The fields of Yorktown fell silent. For the British, it was the end of major combat. For the American, it was the beginning of independence. The Revolutionary War wasn't officially over, but Yorktown was the final crushing blow. The world had just witnessed the unthinkable, an empire brought to its knees by a rebellion and the birth of a new nation. Though the guns fell silent at Yorktown, the war did not officially end for nearly 2 more years. Skirmishes continued on distant frontiers, and negotiations moved slowly across the Atlantic, but the momentum was irreversible. In Paris, American diplomats, Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, and John Jay, sat across from British negotiators to forge a peace. After months of tense discussions, the Treaty of Paris was signed. The terms were stunning. Britain recognized the United States of America as a free and independent nation, with borders stretching from the Atlantic Ocean to the Mississippi River, and from Canada to Florida. Loyalists were promised protection, though many would flee, and British troops withdrew from American soil. For the first time in history, a colony had successfully broken away from its imperial ruler through armed revolution. But independence was only the beginning. The nation faced towering questions. How would it govern itself? How would it unite 13 very different states? And could it live up to the ideals it had fought for? Liberty, equality, and justice. The war had ended, but the real work of building a nation had just begun. The revolution had delivered independence, but it had also left behind a fragile, uncertain union. The 13 former colonies were now 13 sovereign states, tied together loosely under the Articles of Confederation, a system too weak to levy taxes, raise a national army, or settle disputes between states. Economic turmoil gripped the new nation. War debts loomed large. Trade was inconsistent, and internal unrest simmered. Out of this crisis came a new movement to draft a stronger, more unified framework for the Republic. In 1787, delegates from 12 states met in Philadelphia, not just to revise the Articles, but to create something entirely new, the United States Constitution. With bold debate and careful compromise, they forged a system based on checks and balances, federalism, and individual rights. 2 years later, in 1789, George Washington took the oath of office as the first president of the United States. The Revolution had birthed a new kind of nation, not ruled by kings, but governed by the people. A nation where the struggle for liberty would continue to evolve for generations to come. The legacy of the American Revolutionary War reached far beyond its borders. Across the Atlantic, revolutionaries in France drew inspiration from America's victory, igniting their own uprising against monarchy. Yet the new nation also faced contradiction. The Declaration of Independence declared that all men are created equal, but slavery remained deeply rooted in American society. Native American lands were quickly absorbed into the expanding republic, often through violence and broken treaties. Women, too, who had supported the war as spies, nurses, messengers, and organizers, remained excluded from the political life they helped defend. The revolution had opened the door to freedom, but it had not yet walked all the way through. Still, the ideals it unleashed Self-government, liberty, equality before the law would echo through the century. They would be tested in civil wars, expanded in civil rights movements, and carried forward by generations determined to perfect the promise of a more just and free society. The American Revolution was not just the birth of a nation. It was the beginning of a never-ending pursuit of what that nation could become. Nearly 250 years later, the American Revolution remains a defining moment, not just in U.S. history, but in the story of human freedom. It marked the rise of a radical idea that power comes not from bloodlines or divine right, but from the consent of the governed. That government exists to protect the natural rights of its people, not to rule them by force. These were revolutionary thoughts in the 18th century, and they remain powerful today. The men and women who lived through the Revolution were not myths or monuments. They were real people. Farmers and merchants, soldiers and slaves, patriots and loyalists. They were flawed, hopeful, determined, afraid. And together, they reshaped the world. The American Revolution was never just a war between colonies and a king. It was a battle over ideas, over who should hold power and how far freedom could go. And while muskets and bayonets may have won independence, it was belief, unyielding belief in something greater that built a nation, because revolutions don't end with victory, they begin with it. The revolution was won, but the struggle for its meaning, its promises, its principles, its contradictions would carry on. Each generation has faced its own test. To defend liberty, to expand justice, to live up to the words penned in 17. From Civil War to civil rights, from Seneca Falls to Selma, the American story has always been a continuation of the Revolution's question: what does it truly mean to be free? And that question still echoes today. So when we look back at the American Revolution, we are not just remembering a war. We are remembering a beginning.